Procedural generation is a buzz term often used in game development, but what exactly does it mean? In games like Minecraft, it usually refers to an open-generated world, where terrain is generated procedurally. But in the context of most games, it usually refers to generating items and weapons with different prefixes or values to make them unique. In Borderlands, this would be guns with different bases, colors, and attachments. In Terraria, different items with different prefixes. And even in Pokemon, you can think of natures and IVs as a form of procedural generation. So without further ado, let's start up Unity and talk about how to implement procedurally generating items in your game. So I went ahead and I made a new Unity project. I also imported some different parts of a sword that we can use for the project. I just gave it a pixel per unit of 16. And then I gave it, a point filter, so that way there's no filter at all. It's nice and sharp. And then lastly, I disabled compression just so we get the true colors of each of the parts. And now I want to go over how exactly to set these up. So it's important to go to the sprite editor for each of these, and you can't skip this step. And we need to move the center point, which is this right here, this blue thing. We need to move that to the right part of each respective part. So if we look at, I actually went ahead and did it for a few of them. If you look at this, all of our hilts, or all of our handles want to have it at the center of this pixel line here, right? And there's a couple of ways you can think of this. You can either think about how you would line them all up, where the blue circle is touching on each one, and how it would make a sword, right? So we want either in between the lines, like this, or we want in the middle of it, like that, in the middle of the pixel. For our sake though, we're actually going to use in the middle of the pixel, because I think that will give us more options at least. So that way, rather than covering up possibly 4 pixels, we'll only be covering up 1. So we're going to put it in the center of each point that it might come in contact with. So we're going to do apply. And now the other hilt, or other handle, also needs to be in the center. So about here, we do apply. This one needs to be in the center, which is good. This one needs to be right about here. And obviously you want to be more accurate than I am right now. Just that way everything lines up perfectly. So this is in the center. This is not correct. This should be right over here. Then press apply. So now you can imagine that when we line up all the parts, this circle is going to be constant throughout. Kind of like you're shoving a needle through that blue hole, and everything kind of goes through the needle. Make sure this one's a little more aligned. So once you do this, we can actually get into generating the swords, which is going to take a little bit more setting up. If we go back to scene mode, we can go to sprites here. We can drop in, let's just drop in 3 parts that we can start to line up. And we're going to need to put them on a sorting layer now, so that way they line up properly. So this camera icon is slightly in the way, so I'm going to move these guys over. But as you can see, this isn't in front, and it's not guaranteed to be in front, which is bad. So we need to fix that. And how do we fix that? Well, pretty simply, just put all the parts onto a similar sorting layer. So we're going to put that on the weapon layer, and you can make new ones by pressing add. So now that these guys are all on the same layer, we can choose when they'll render in order. So we want this to render first. These two don't matter because they're going to assumably be covered up by this, but you can give them different if you don't want any sort of randomness to the order and you want to just, kind of be sure. So now we can kind of guess how these are going to line up. Probably something like this. And it's hard to see, but there is actually some pixels here. I just somehow got the exact color of the background, but as you can see, that's somewhat of what it's going to look like. I'll make it maybe like something more easy to see on. Sure. Okay. And that's what it's going to look like once it generates, but obviously right now nothing's generating. So how do we get things to generate? Well, we want to use a model where every part has its own attributes and, things to it. So we want the iron blade to produce some sort of damage. We want the handle to maybe produce accuracy, or something along those lines, maybe the swing speed. Maybe the hilt also has a say in swing speed. And we can then either, layer, multiply, modify, whatever we want to do with that. But everything is going to be in charge of its own values, basically. Like even a handle could maybe have some sort of a damage modifier on it. So we pretty much need to make 3 different classes. So that's going to be the handle, the guard, and the blade itself. So the first thing we want to do is determine how exactly we're going to stack all these effects and what exactly the effects are going to be. So without a doubt, we want to have some sort of damage modifier, and we're going to make it a float. So we're going to do public float, and we're going to call it damage. We also want some sort of, maybe for a sword, we want like some sort of swing speed. Maybe some sort of knockback as well would be important. So we can do these 3. We'll do damage, speed, and knockback. And from here, we got to figure out, well, which one is going to be the main, let's say, like, holder of all that. What's the base? And, it makes sense for the sake of how things line up to do the guard. But actually, when you think about it, I'd say the blade itself is the most important part of the sword, right? So whether or not you even want the guard or blade or guard or handle to do any sort of damage, or have any sort of say in damage, like, that's up to you. But personally, I think that the damage should be determined mainly by the blade, or maybe most of the stats mainly by the blade, and the other ones kind of add on their own little things to it. So the blade is going to be the main deciding factor, and we're going to view the handle and the guard as accessories of the blade. And from here, we just have the 3 parts of the sword, and now we're going to make something that compiles everything, aka the weapon class itself. We click on the iron blade, we have, some values we could set. So we're going to set the base damage of this to 10. We're going to call the base speed of this to 10, and the base knockback of this is going to be 10. I'm going to say for my game that 10 across the boards is a pretty standard set of stats. And from here, we can take other blades in the future and either, change them a little bit to be, maybe more damaging, less speed, more knockback, maybe just better in every respect, right? But that would all, I'm just going to say 10 for everything is handled as like kind of like a standard blade. From here, we're going to call this force handle something that would maybe increase your speed by 1. And we can use floats here, so let's get fancy. 1.2. Maybe it increases your knockback by decreases your knockback by like, 1.5. And no damage modification. This black hilt here, our black guard here, I'm going to say it maybe decreases your speed by like 0.9. Maybe gives you more knockback on it though, and the damage increase looks pretty menacing. Let's say it gives you a little bit more damage. So we can take these 3 parts now, and we can make something called sword parts. And just to stay organized, we're gonna want the handle, blade, and lastly the guard. So we take the handle, the blade, the guard, and we just simply make, was this the, what did I just click on? The hilt, okay. Or the guard, I don't know why I called it that. Drop the iron blade into a blade, and now we're going to drop the forced handle into a handle. So we have these 3 folders, and we're going to, as we populate more weapon parts, that's how we're going to organize things for the sake of automation, organization, and I don't know, just good game design. Just organize your it's easy enough. Let's make the weapon handling class now. So I'm going to call this weapon, and it didn't actually open. So let's think about what exactly a weapon needs to do. Well, for one, it's going to need all the stats we just had, right? It's going to need knockback. It's going to need speed. And then lastly, I think a weapon needs durability. However, the durability could also be calculated based on the parts. Probably should be as well, but it's also important to know that there is durability that you start with, and as you use it, this needs to deplete. So the question is, how do we handle that? And we're going to handle it on the weapon class. Any sort of, we're going to call it metadata, data that's happening to the initial generation is going to happen in the weapon class. So when initially generated, it's going to pull a lot of values from these different parts. And say in our game, we can upgrade the parts of our weapons. It's important that we remember our roots and pull these stats from there, but it's also important that we can apply metadata to our weapons, which will be done in the weapon class. So we should add some durability thing. So I'm going to add durability to each and every one of these. Okay. It's going to be the durability added. You probably want to know the initial durability or the max durability. So we're going to have durability and we're going to have max durability. Say we can repair our item. We want to make sure we have some sort of amount that we can repair to. And I'm going to say that durability is something that's additive. So the blade itself is going to add to the hilt, is going to add to the handle. Not something that can be subtracted from. Just kind of like look at the part, how durable is that part, and then we're going to sum it to get the max durability. So right now we're facing a challenge with the data structure of the weapon system. And you know, a great way to do this is actually just whipping out Microsoft Paint and just drawing out how exactly we want to do it. So one way to do it is we spawn in a weapon game object that then generates its parts, and then those parts are then used within the weapon itself. So the parts are then going to generate it. As parts change, they communicate with the weapon as such. The weapon's basically, you know, it has some sort of function in it that gets all of its weapon parts. And this is fine, but the thing is, we don't really want to generate a weapon from within itself, if that makes any sense. I think the best way to handle this kind of problem is have some sort of outside script generate the weapon, then generate the parts of the weapon. And now, once this has been done once, the weapon can now handle itself as an existing entity. But the weapon itself has no generation capabilities. And what's good about this is that depending on the situation, the enemy that was killed, what it can generate, you can use this script anywhere to just kind of generate weapons statically. Rather than having to make everything reference the weapon game object, you can just call this static script that just kind of exists throughout our project. And we're going to call this the weapon manager, most likely. You'll find in game design it's really important to make these managing scripts, because you don't really want your game components themselves to be complicated. You want to keep them as simple and practical as possible to prevent any sort of, like, you know, unforeseen glitches or just confusion in general. You'll find your games can grow much faster if you keep things logical and practical. Probably most importantly, you want it to be practical. So the weapon itself will not be generating itself, but it will be initially generated, and then it will be smart enough to realize when a component changes. So I went ahead and made a weapon manager script. We're going to click over here, do Control-Shift-N, create an empty. We're going to zero out this empty, and we're just going to call this the weapon manager. This is something I do in a lot of my games. Creating managers in the scenes are really good. I honestly create managers just for static things I want throughout the game. So I can, you know, just do a simple update prefab and it'll update all the static things throughout the scenes. So this weapon manager component is going to have some static classes. I think the most important one is going to be static void generate weapon, and from here we're going to do vector 2 called the position, and for now that's all we're going to do. Obviously you can make overrides of this with more specific fields, but for now we're just going to say generate weapon, and this is going to generate one of these. Then once it's generated, it's going to call a function in here that's going to be called get stats. We actually don't need update in here for now. Get stats is going to then get all of its stats from its lower level things. So what we're looking at right now is a pretty organized data structure, because once this is set up and once this is set up, all you have to do is make new handles, guards, and blades, and they'll all fall into play. So before we actually create the generation procedure, we need to do a couple of things just to keep things organized. And that first thing we have to do is use Unity tags. These are super important. They'll keep your game like really organized, and they'll also make sure a lot of errors don't get thrown later on. So we're gonna make tags for each of the sword components. So we're gonna make a tag for blade. We're gonna make a tag for handle. We're gonna make a tag for guard. And lastly, we're gonna make a tag, probably the most important one, for sword itself. So these are all things that we can actually use. We can even make this be weapon if we wanted to, but we're gonna make an empty now as well, and we're gonna call this empty at weapon, and this is gonna have the weapon script on it. All zeros, as you can see. This is just kind of like a dummy thing that will be spawning into the scene to generate into. So just prefab that, and we can actually just delete it now. If you're a bit of an organization freak like me, you can just zero out the X, Y, and Z for this. Doesn't really matter though, but just kind of a fresh canvas. And one last thing we want to do actually is public. We're gonna say string the name of the weapon. You can do this. We can actually use Unity's name feature to do this as well, is one way to look at it. But I think it's kind of good to store this internally. As you see, name is actually conflicting with the Unity name. But you know, let's store it internally just for our organization's sake. But when we're building the names, we're probably going to do that using the sword parts or something like that. But we'll get to that. So I'm trying to do less code on screen so I can, you know, save your time, and I'm just going to type stuff up and explain it. I might even start actually just doing a fast forward of me just coding, because, you know, I make mistakes and stuff. I'd rather make sure that what I'm explaining is correct. So I've changed a couple of things. First off, we're using public here instead of static. I'm actually just going to be doing a static reference to this version of the weapon manager itself, which is what this is doing. It's just setting a reference of the static one to itself, and I'll show you how we'll call that later if that doesn't make sense right now. But the reason we're doing that is so we can do really easy public references in Unity. So I'll give you an example of that right now. If we go over here and we look at our weapon manager here, you'll see that we actually have fill in the blanks now, which are super easy to use. So in our blank weapon thing, we just simply drop that there. We have one blade at the moment. We have one sword. I should rename that to guard. I don't know why I called it swords. There we go. We have one guard. But you know what? That's fine, because in the future, if we made more, this would be a really good system of expanding. And being able to drag and drop the new ones in here, or just drag and drop a bunch at once, is like super easy to use. Zero. Our weapon manager is going to instantiate a blank weapon. Then it's going to choose from our list of handles. Then it's going to choose from our list of guards. And then it's going to choose from our list of blades. And now once that's done, we're just going to call weapon.getComponent. We're going to get the weapon component. And from here, we're going to call that function we just made, which is called setParts. And we're going to set the parts in the order of handle, guard, blade. So we're going to pass these parts we just created. Now the weapon's aware of what its parts are. And now all we have to do is call get stats. There we go. Okay, so we set the parts and we get the stats. Now, we can call get stats after setting parts, because logically if you ever set the parts, you also want to get the stats, right? So that would actually, I can't see a world where we would want to set the parts without getting the stats. And these are things to think about when you're making games, like how can we simplify things? And basically what we do here is just add up the damages across the weapons after we get our parts, and then we add up the durabilities. So at this point you're probably wondering, you know, if these classes are all identical, why don't we just have one thing called weapon part with each of the components? And you very well could do that, but if you want to make your game really complicated and have all sorts of different things that different weapon parts do, and you want to stay organized, you know, you might want to use this model where you have each part gets its own class and gets handled differently. Because right now we can handle each one differently. We're aware of what's a handle, what's a guard, and what's a blade. We don't just see everything as a single part. Our weapon's aware of a lot right now. It's aware of what its parts are. It's aware of the stats of all of its parts combined. It's aware of how durable it is. The only thing it's not aware of right now is its name, which is something that we can generate as well using weapon parts. And that's much more of a creative thing. There really is no right answer to that. So this right here, if we call this, we'll make something called void start. If we just call generate weapon at new vector 2 0, 0, this should generate a weapon at 0, 0. We should get one of these. So I'm going to delete that, and we're going to press play, and I guess let's just see what happens. And as you can see, we generated a weapon. This is super important. After you spawn in each of the parts, you need to zero them around locally where the weapon is. And as a result, every time we press the play button, we get a new weapon. All sorts of weapons, each one with their own unique set of stats. So if we take this one, for example, we look at it, it has its own durability, speed, knockback, all results of addition. So let's have some fun with this. We'll do a for loop, and we're gonna do across maybe 25 different weapons. There really aren't that many worlds of possibility. I think there's 9 different weapons we can even generate right now. So we're absolutely guaranteed to get 2 of the same weapons at least 2 times. So we're going to generate the weapon, and we're just going to do I for the X, and you'll just see what kind of spread we're going to be looking at. This is a great way to show, though, that we are generating a bunch of different types of weapons. Each one gets their own little game object, which means that they are actually like existing in the world. You can easily make some sort of data structure that saves the weapon and its parts, because it's so well organized and kept here. You can easily access any weapons data, because if you just set weapon here to the sword tag, anything with the sword tag now is a compiled weapon, very neatly kept. So for final touches, I'm going to do some hitbox setup as well as some weapon naming. If we go to our sword parts and we go to the blades, you'll notice that Iron Blade and Ruby Edge both have 2 very different hitboxes, so to say. So obviously the range of the sword is important for a game, so we're going to give these polygon colliders. We're going to make polygon collider and wrap. You can actually we're going to get Panteris with the blade that's used on this one. It probably goes like a there too. So there we go. That's one box down, reset the trigger. Just for the sake of like making the blades velocity trigger, the sharpening player. And similarly, we just do polygon collider on this thing, but you don't control the point between them. And for the sake of efficiency, we can pretty accurate hitbox, right? Nothing like down to the pixels, but pretty good approximation. There does come out a little bit here. We can back in. And this is all possible because I feel more accurate. Now this is all possible because we're handling our blades as their own objects, right? We're tagging the blades, hopefully tagging the blades as blade, although I think I forgot to tag everything. You go right here, I believe these, honestly, they're actually tagged boxes. But every time you can access them, they're very well aware of what part is. That's really important, so as well. And it's really good to keep organized like this in the future, because as you add new game features, you can get more creative with it. Like you can make different parts do different things. So if I generate some more swords now, you'll see that if I click on any blade, there is actually a hitbox around that now, and everything is tagged accordingly. And it's a complete weapon comprised of the different parts. So there's a lot of ways to go about naming things. We can do things like I said earlier, Borderlands and Terraria, where you have a base and then we add a prefix to it. So maybe an iron sword would be like swingy iron sword, right? Where swingy is a prefix given to by, say, the handle, or maybe like a defensive iron sword if the guard is the dominant part. We could do a lot of things with the naming system. I'm just gonna throw one out there that's kind of silly and fun. Let's just make it so that way the name is comprised of the first 3 letters of the 3 parts, right? So the name just be our handle, name object, name. We want to get the that's actually 0 to 3. So the first 3 characters of the handle name. We're gonna add that to 3 characters of our team. We're gonna add that to the first 3 characters of the blade. Now, obviously, this is a terrible naming convention, but it is also not the worst naming convention. The absolute worst thing you can do in your game is make your names completely random. It's super important that any sword or weapon with the same exact parts has the same name across all clients, because otherwise your game is just going to be confusing, hard to communicate with other people and whatnot. As long as your naming convention is consistent, if all the parts of the item are the same, then you can use this powerful generation to just create hundreds of items that actually will have some sort of identifiable name that people can discuss, right? A good example is the double penetrating unkempt herald. When I talk about that, my friends understand that I'm talking about the unkempt herald with the double barrel on it, so it shoots twice. If names were completely random, it would be almost impossible to communicate items in your game. So we're going to set the this. I'm also going to set the name itself too. And if you now, hopefully, might recall this later. So we're going to get the stats, and then we're going to get the name of the item. So we pause here. You'll see that we have, it's kind of silly, but we have, you know, different names of items, and it's all based on the different handles of it. So the four woo rube implies that you have a forest handle with a, I guess, wooden guard and then a ruby blade. And you can even do things like say do all this. Say what names equal to substring, what name substring from 0 1 2 caps or 2 upper and add that to the rest of it to be from 1 onward, that applies onward to lower. That's just string stuff. Nothing really good here. Just to make things look nicer. So now you can see our weapon names are actually kind of, rather than being camel case like they were before, they are starting to blend a little bit. Obviously this is just gibberish. Not the best way to name your items, but you could very well do some sort of system like this where you can generate mythical names or like some sort of crazy fun name using the weapon parts. But what's important is that every 4 Wurio blade is the same, and I can see there's 3 of them right here, and they're all named the same thing, so we can actually identify stuff. So before we close the video, I just want to talk a little bit about how powerful this is and, you know, just quick math behind it. Okay, so you take the hilts, the blades, and the guards, and you multiply by each one, and that's the amount of swords you have in the universe. So if I were to use a calculator real quick, we can see that in my world I have 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8, right? But let's clear that now. And let's take a look at, say I had 10 of each, right? That's a good starting place. A good way to think about this is if you do, say, the multiplication of hilts times blades. So say I want to make a new guard for my game, right? I already have 10 hilts and 10 blades. If I were to make a new guard, go from 10 to 11, I would get 100 new possibilities, right? Presumably if I went to 11 now, rather than the old universe where I had 1,000, I now have 1,100 items in my game. So 100 new things exist now by one little change that probably took maybe 3 or 4 minutes to implement. Now, of course, with great power comes great responsibility. You don't want to start just creating a bunch of garbage for your game. You want to make sure every part has lore, every item has lore, everything that's being put into the weapons, you want to make sure it's really good quality. Definitely quality over quantity. your game could have billions of items in them, but if none of them are interesting or distinguishable, then, like, you know, who cares, right? So a few things to consider. Yeah, you have 1,100 items in your game now, but also, like, the blade is really what determines the sword. So what you really have is 10 different swords with different configurations, right? Like, I know Borderlands likes to advertise billions of weapons, when in reality you just have, you know, maybe 1,000 base weapons with accessories that can be combined and different colors can be created and whatnot. So don't think like, wow, I have 1,100 unique items. Think like, I have a lot of variation on an already established, like, you know, set of blades, and that's more valuable than having, you know, just 10 simple swords. You now have a lot of ways to configure 10 swords, which adds replay value. It makes it interesting. It adds suspense too, especially if you do weighted probability, where different parts have different weight to them. You can take the shiny Pokemon approach, where maybe there's a really small chance your weapon like glistens and it does double damage, or maybe it glows red and it has double the speed, or maybe both can happen at the same time. I mean, procedural generation is really powerful if you do it correctly, and that's kind of what I was trying to convey in this video. It's how easy you can implement it, how creative you can get with it, and most importantly, like, how much replay value it can add to a game that, you know, doesn't have it. So just consider that if you're making a game, or if you're just interested in the topic. It's a pretty useful tool. So that's going to be it. Thanks for watching.